Hello and welcome back to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. First things first, I have now set up the Twitter account for the podcast. Our account is @hated_and_dead, or you can just search Twitter for The Hated and the Dead and you'll see us. If you use Twitter regularly, please follow the account because I will use the account to notify you of new episodes. Moving on, the subject of today's episode is Indira Gandhi. Indira Gandhi was Prime Minister of India twice between 1966 and her assassination in 1984. Why should you be interested in her? Well, her position at the helm of India made her one of the most powerful women of the 20th century, and, in a time when we talk often of getting more women into positions of power, studying the powerful women of the past is a must. Even though Gandhi's reputation as an intransigent and unpleasant person precedes her, I came away from today's podcast viewing her in a more sympathetic light. My guest for this podcast is Dr Vernon Hewitt, a former professor at the University of Bristol. Vernon is well versed in the politics of India and South Asia. Indeed, he actually met Mrs Gandhi for a, quote, lacklustre interview just before her death in 1984. He is also an old lecturer of mine. We did experience some sound issues in this episode. This was actually the first episode I recorded and was still getting used to the setup. Nevertheless, Vernon's insights are witty and erudite, and I hope to have him back on The Hated and the Dead soon. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Indira Gandhi. Hi Vernon, how's it going?
It's going very well, Tom. How are you?
I'm alright, thank you. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this. For those listening, Vernon used to be a lecturer of mine at the University of Bristol. In our email chain, in the run-up to this podcast, he did admit that he did not remember me as a student, but he did once pay me the interesting compliment of saying that I bore an uncanny resemblance to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Vernon, is the resemblance still there?
No, it's not actually. I'm glad to say. It must have been just the glasses, you see. That's what I meant.
Well, really, it was quite useful that you said that because I don't think a Jacob Rees-Mogg lookalike would last very long in Bristol.
No, probably not. No.
So I think
certainly not now.
I think you probably did me a favour. So, Indira Gandhi, then. I'd like to start the podcast by saying that reading about her, she exudes warmth and optimism and light. But actually, reading about her, I discovered quite a flawed and tormented person who led, in many ways, quite a sad life. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I do, actually, to some extent. I mean, the extraordinary thing about Indira Gandhi is to sort of conceptualize her whole career. And one of the ironies is that, I mean, counterfactually, let's assume that she had died 10 years before she did. Let's say she died in 1974. Her legacy would have been fundamentally different to the one that she left when she was assassinated in 1984. And we do have sort of anecdotes from childhood. She did seem to have a lonely childhood. She was very much devoted to her father. And there is a rather interesting entry in a letter. W.H. Auden went to meet Nehru and was rather scathing about this rather quiet, sort of slightly bookish girl.
Yes.
Who was actually rather intense and not very good at sort of small talk.
It definitely seems as if that intensity carried on into her political career. I mean, she was born in 1917 as Indira Nehru. As you said, her father was the Indian independence leader, Jawaharlal Nehru. I mean, as a young woman, her father's political career must have had a considerable effect on her. Can you talk a bit more about her formative years? What was her political baptism like?
Well, I think, her baptism was basically seeing her father either placed under house arrest or addressing large rallies, or indeed dealing with the complexities of the nationalist movement with all the strains, and particularly later with the Mahatma. So I think she had a lonely childhood in terms of her father just being absent, and I think her political baptism was to be, in a way, his secretary and assistant. And in a sense, I think she worshipped Nehru, but in a way she recognized that he was not going to pay her a great deal of attention. So I think in that sense that's where I think the isolation starts.
So she didn't involve herself very much directly with the independence movement, aside from what her father did?
No, I mean, by the 30s, she's becoming sort of active in terms of being his secretary and almost sort of, going around with him. But I mean, I think that she becomes, I think there's also a sense that she sees the whole kind of Nehru family as being, in a way, the arbiter of independence. So I think that sort of, to put it bluntly, that kind of the ego that she wrestles with herself later as a politician, I think probably starts there. And I think that she was just somebody who felt that it was her duty to effectively go into politics, whether or not she necessarily really wanted to do that.
Do you think it's fair to say that if her father had not been who he was, she wouldn't have ever gone near politics?
I think that's right. Actually, I think she would. I mean, she was not necessarily intellectual. She was. I think her whole career would have been entirely different. But she is somebody who then, at some stage then gets a sort of a cabinet office. She's education minister eventually in the sort of late 50s, and that's the sort of route. But it's important to recognise that she actually got there because she was Nehru's daughter.
Absolutely. To just look a bit more at the 1940s then, she marries Feroz Gandhi in 1942 and takes his surname to become Indira Gandhi. No relation to Mahatma Gandhi, it should be noted, of course. And following Indian independence in 1947, her father becomes the first Prime Minister of India. I know he was obviously a political giant who governed India for a very long time, but can you give a quick appraisal of what India under Nehru was like and what sort of a politician he was?
Well, he was a giant, and of course, in a sense now, so long after independence and so long after that generation of independent leaders across the former colonial empires have gone, I think he still stands the test of time in many senses. Here was a man who recognized the centrality he had, and he once very teasingly wrote a letter to some of his chief ministers saying, look, if I was a dictator, I might do this or that. But here was a man who was completely dedicated to running a democratic system of government. We can argue that democracies evolved when there were equalities were not too severe, when they kind of eased. He adopted a political system with a country that was, facing considerable difficulties at the time of independence. He was a parliamentarian as well. He was committed to the running of parliament. I mean, he kept what he felt were the best kind of aspects of British colonial rule, which was forms of diarchy between the centre and the states. So he creates and presides over a unique experiment, really, which is a parliamentary-led federal system, which, of course, to the British was completely paradoxical. And he believed in the etiquette of politics. So he was, to coin a phrase, slightly cliche, he was a gentleman. And I think that, courteous at a time when, you have a majority in the Lok Sabha, which is just ludicrous. I mean, you could have, he could have done anything he wanted, I think. And I think he felt that this system was good for India. It was good for creating the kind of socialist democracy he wanted to create. So I think he was a visionary as well. I mean, quite a unique individual. And in some senses, he set about a system that is effectively still going today, and ironically survived his daughter's attempt to undo it.
Yes.
So, I mean, there were failures in the sense that he always had problems with what was to become the RSS and the sort of Hindutva wing, and that was an issue he had difficulties with. He also had difficulties with reforms because he recognised that the electoral machinery that he was building in terms of states and sort of Congress state parties basically were blocking key aspects of social reform because they were basically run by dominant local elites. And that was a dilemma that sort of made Indian democracy problematic. I mean, characterized by slow growth rates, certainly compared to other parts of the world.
Sure.
Very difficult, but, nonetheless, a very key visionary politician.
I think the system that he created has certainly survived in many ways against the odds when other systems which were closer to the British system, like the Sri Lankan one, have not. And in the 1940s, many people would have thought it more likely that somewhere like Sri Lanka would have survived as a democracy and India would not have done. Yeah. I mean, those qualities that you talked about that Nehru possessed, gentlemanliness, he was a consensual political figure. Those aren't really qualities that are generally attributed to his daughter.
No. I mean, partly because I think she, to her credit, so she becomes Prime Minister in 1966. So there's a slight interregnum. Bahadur Lal Shastri becomes Prime Minister after Nehru's death in 1964. He dies in Tashkent at a summit meeting, and Indira Gandhi becomes Prime Minister. And I think that, to be fair to her, India in the 60s is a very difficult country to be running. The immediate ease, if you like, of the kind of reforms in terms of industry and social reforms, and certainly land reform, has become much more complicated. And the electoral landscape has become much more complicated. So Congress's sort of hegemonic position, both in the national polls and in the states, is beginning to be corroded. So in a sense, she is, you would imagine that may have encouraged a kind of consensual approach now, because you're dealing with political parties which are coming of age and which are now winning members in these state elections and in the Lok Sabha. But she wasn't a natural parliamentarian like her father. She in debates, she had a very sort of quiet, rather shy sort of approach. And, compared to the sort of, Nehru loved the kind of stock speeches. She was somebody who I think felt exposed as a parliamentarian. And I think also what you see very quickly, and this is certainly true by 1967, which is a key set of elections, which brings a large number of non-Congress governments to the states. She falls in with a kind of clique. She has a group of people who became, in a sense, her sort of sounding board. And in a way, it would be wrong to say she was secretive, but she kept her cards very close to her chest, and who she would consult and who she would listen to.
So the consensual nature of Nehru's governance is eroded further and further into the 60s.
Yes.
The reason I wanted to contrast her style with her father's style is to try and give a bit of background to the events of 1975, the so-called emergency. For people listening who don't know very much about this period, what was the emergency and why does it come about?
Well, the emergency is an extraordinary event, really. I mean, it basically, the trigger is a series of court cases against the Prime Minister for electoral malpractice. And the charges initially are quite minor. In fact, at one stage, her then Home Secretary said it's rather like a Prime Minister being arrested for a parking ticket. So effectively, the allegations were that she'd used, during a, rather like we have in the UK, you can't use a senior government minister for an electoral event. There's a separation between state and party. She'd not observed that. She'd also not paid electoral bills that she'd used for her rallies. But the point was that she became convinced that it was a conspiracy to remove her. And so effectively, she kind of upped the ante. Now, the other point to bear in mind is that this very small drama is being played out against a very serious set of socio-economic issues, particularly agricultural crop failures, very high inflation, and political instability within state Congress parties as well as opposition-run state governments. Because effectively what Indira Gandhi's fear about this conspiracy is it was to do with her own Congress chief ministers. And what she did something that her father would have been rather mortified by. She collapsed the parliamentary party into the actual administration of the party itself. So the distinction between the Congress Party, the All Indian Congress Committee, and all the kind of party system, and the parliamentary party that met in the Lok Sabha and coordinated the members of the assemblies in the state, was centralized under her control.
Right.
And her argument for doing that at the time is that she recognized that she was using a phrase that was very important in the run-up to the emergency, which is Garibi Hatao, abolish poverty. And she believed that the people in her own party in the states were blocking much-needed land reform. And that, in a way, one of the solutions to the agrarian crisis and the dramatic drop in production was that she had not been able to get through this land reform process. Now, all of these ideas, which were essentially, you need to centralize control to get things done, are hanging around, and they kind of coalesce in her mind as she is facing this personal challenge to her in terms of electoral malpractice.
And what is the result of this coalescing of different forces? What happens in 1975?
Well, basically, she gets the case goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court basically hands down a sort of ruling that says we are going to restrict what the Prime Minister can do because we feel that this needs to be something that we take consonance of as a court, and we will continue the investigations. And of course, the opposition at this stage are saying, well, you can't be Prime Minister under these circumstances. It makes a mockery of this, and you should resign. And what then happens is that she effectively, with a whole group of people in the cabinet, but also most significantly members of their own family by now, most notoriously Sanjay Gandhi, gets hold of the Constitution and realizes that she can declare an internal emergency, Article 356, which basically, in conjunction with Article 352, will enable her to collapse the federal system, suspend elections, and then sort of do that to save her career, but also using that. And I think she genuinely believed this. I think this is the tragedy. In doing that, she would save the country. So you suddenly have what appeared to be the fate of many post-colonial states. Opposition members are arrested, rallies are banned, the press is censored. I mean, terribly crudely. I mean, and effectively we have, 3 years of a one-party state.
So India became a dictatorship, in essence.
Yes. I mean, and, carrying out notorious policies. I mean, one of the most notorious is effectively embarking upon a forced sterilisation campaign. That, again, you could argue that she was not aware that it was going on to the extent it was. But again, the irony of centralising India, and this is a logic that her father understood far better than her. You centralise the federal system and you don't control anything. So actually, having then declared an emergency and closed down Parliament, she had no idea what was going on.
So if you try and control everything, you end up controlling nothing.
Absolutely.
Right.
So, I mean, it was very clear that, in fact, many of her sort of lackeys in the states that she had put in as chief ministers now, these were people loyal loyal to her, not necessarily the Congress Party, were just making up reports and sending them back to Delhi to keep her happy.
Because I suppose India is such a large country that it's going to rely on a certain degree of clientelism and using local elites to your own advantage.
Yes.
It's intrinsic to the system, really.
Yes, but the key point is that certainly that elite had consolidated itself under Nehru, and Nehru was fully aware that he was having as much difficulty with his own chief ministers as he was with those states that were now producing opposition governments. But in a way, there was still a kind of conversation. But that conversation completely ceases. And it's also clear that, to some extent, and this is the most interesting aspect to me, I think, of the emergency, is that she is losing control of key actors, again, arguably her son, who have a much more draconian idea of what should be done. So even though she's declared the emergency, she's disguised a personal attack on her as an attack upon the country and is seeking to claim she's defending it. She is also aware that there are people in her party who actually wanted to go much, much further.
Yes.
And actually, so there was a debate around 1976, the early part of 1977, about how permanent the emergency will become. Because basically there has been a whole raft of statutes passed by a dead parliament that effectively appeared to be entrenching authoritarian government.
What was the reason for a program of forced sterilisation?
Well, one of the arguments was that the so-called Hindu rate of growth, which of course is a term rather we don't use anymore because it's much better, but certainly during the 60s, India was growing very slowly because it had blocks on production, partly to do, again, with debates about land reform, but it did have a very high population growth. So you're continually dividing any gains in GDP. And I think there was a kind of technocratic argument that was being used in the planning ministry and in all the kind of the bureaucracy that said, look, to some extent, one solution to this, one way of breaking through this growth figure, 2.3%, 4% growth a year, is to control the population. And there had been voluntary attempts at family planning under Nehru, but basically what you suddenly got is a much more coercive strategy in which basically lists are given out with numbers. Chief ministers have to produce these numbers and say, we've sterilised X number of people. Again, to your earlier point, we know full well, certainly from some of the southern states, they just made the figures up just to keep Delhi happy. But in the states around New Delhi, Haryana, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, they were camps set up, people were taken and they were sterilised.
Wow, it's hideous.
Yeah.
One of the...
the other point, sorry, Tom, is that in many cases it was completely random. So they were sterilising people who were no longer actually reproductive or starting families, elderly people, and they were sterilising very young people. And of course, in the socio-economic context of the importance of the family, the consequences of this were, catastrophic, actually, certainly psychological.
It did much more damage than it could have ever done benefit, really. Yeah, that's hideous. I didn't really know very much about the details of that. I mean, how does this period of emergency come to an end?
Well, that is quite interesting as well, because there's two stories here. This depends again on the legacy. If at sort of 3 a.m, the ghost of Nehru comes into the bedroom and says, look, I think you've gone a bit too far, dear. But she suddenly, I think, realizes that she is not in control. I think she also realizes that she is losing control of Sanjay. So Sanjay Gandhi, by this stage, has got a little sort of collection of people around him. Brahmananda Reddy, who was the Home Minister, who initially he disliked very much, but seems to have come over. Groups of what are ministers of state, deputy ministers like Om Mehta, who are basically no longer reporting to Mrs. G, they're going to Sanjay. And, there are extraordinary stories that one would come across. At one stage, I interviewed most of the cabinet ministers at that time, much later in the 80s. And, you were told stories that Sanjay would actually physically attack ministers during cabinet meetings. But of course, he had no place in the cabinet meeting. He didn't actually have a place in the cabinet. So one of the arguments is that she kind of realised that the time was fast going to the close where she would actually lose control of the party, and so she called snap elections. Now, I mean, the other point to bear in mind, of course, she'd arrested most of the opposition, so she probably thought she was going to win.
But she doesn't.
But she doesn't, and in fact, what happens is a remarkable landslide to a coalition of opposition parties that have come together in prison. Ironically, again, very much like the British brought the Indian National Congress Party together by putting them all in prison and letting them talk together and learn how to cooperate. And they form what's called the Janata Party. And that is effectively swept into power in 1977.
One of the odd things in hindsight, though, about this period is that even though Gandhi loses in 77, she leads the Congress Party back to victory in 1980.
Yes.
And that begs the question, if she was able to come back to have this renaissance in 1980, it suggests that there was quite a high level of support for her and maybe for the emergency as well in the 1970s amongst ordinary Indians. It must have been at least somewhat popular for her to be able to have this comeback.
Well, it's one of those extraordinary things again of India, in a sense, before at the end of kind of Congress rule, which takes place, of course, in the 1990s. I mean, her restoration is partly because I think she appeared to be remorseful. I mean, she played the part of a widow and of an elderly woman, and Indians have a great deal of respect for that. I mean, she, in many senses, personified, and increasingly came to personify sort of Bharat Mata, sort of Mother India. And to be fair, in a way, the Janata Party just very quickly fell apart. So this kind of hodgepodge of political parties which came together to restore democracy didn't really have a cohesive plan of what to do. The other point I would say is that her restoration, and this is in a way the most, perhaps more damning, in my opinion, than the emergency, is that she is very clever in identifying that the main opposition to her, and this is true almost of the period just before the emergency, came from the Hindu right. And so what she begins to do, Garibi Hatao, socialism had been the sort of touchstone of politics prior to the emergency, and indeed during the emergency. Now it's much more Hindutva. It's much more the recognition that Hindus are the natural majority, and that in a way these are the people who should be sort of her natural kind of allies. And there's lots of explanations, or there's lots of possible accounts as to why by the 90s we were to have the rise of the BJP, a Hindu nationalist party, and now why we have a prime minister in India who has a majority of a huge majority in the Lok Sabha with the BJP. Things, incidentally, Tom, which if you'd have asked me when I was a young academic, I would have said would never have happened. Thank God no one ever asked me that, because I would have got that spectacularly wrong. But I think the start of that is, again, Indira Gandhi's restoration and her manipulation this time, not of the fear of conspiracy or sort of revolution, but the actual manipulation of religious identity.
So again, another irony, really, given that her father was a diehard secularist.
That's right, absolutely. And I think that in a way, it's something that he would simply not have recognised. And but in a way she moves. I mean, certainly the politics, the fallout from the emergency, you had communalized politics much more, by which I mean you'd made it very obvious by 1979, sort of 80, that as a Hindu or a Muslim or a Sikh, you had a political identity as much as a socio-religious one. And that was something that someone who was as canny as Indira Gandhi recognized she could use. So she's restored in 1980 with a sizable majority in the Lok Sabha, but with a very kind of open-ended program. There's no particular sort of strategy by this stage. And of course, what she is beginning to have to deal with, partly a legacy of her own centralization, is the rise of state governments now who want greater autonomy from Delhi. So you have a series of attempts, Assam, Punjab most notoriously, where they want devolution. They've got a federal system, but they want far more significant guarantees against central intervention. And it seems to be that from 1980 until her assassination in 84, she had no solution to that. It was basically carrot stick, but it was mostly stick. And of course, most notoriously in terms of Operation Blue Star, where she goes, she just sends the army into Punjab, having played the Sikhs in a different, complex game about promising devolution, greater rights, greater autonomy, changing the state boundaries, but not delivering.
I think I'm right in saying that autonomy and autonomous rule for the states has become another prominent trope in Indian politics since the 1980s. In lots of ways, the circumstances of her death fit well with the chaotic nature of her time in power. Can you talk a bit about her death? What happened?
Well, interestingly, I was in Delhi at the time, actually, because I had gone, I was finishing my PhD, and I had gone to stay in Jawaharlal Nehru University in South Delhi. And I had been able this is when I'm kind of interviewing people who had been cabinet ministers, including Siddhartha Shankar Ray, who was Chief Justice at the time, and who in fact came up with the idea of the internal emergency. He's the guy who said, look, wait a minute, we can do this. Go to page 49455 of the Constitution. Let's try that. And I had a very lackluster interview with Indira Gandhi, which was utterly bizarre, that you could almost sort of, as a, going to, I would say, a minor Oxford college. I wouldn't call Nuffield a minor. But, they just let you in. It was all a bit weird. But where I think she was still in power, obviously. So the point about the other ministers is that they were retired and they were willing to talk. She, of course, didn't want to talk about the emergency. Why on earth would she? And so it was a kind of bizarre sort of thing. This is around she's assassinated in the October. This would have been about May that I met her in her office in the Lok Sabha. And frankly, I was incredibly nervous, and all I can remember is she had a very large, what looked like a man's watch on her wrist, and she just kept playing with this watch. So it was all a bit strange. But
it sounds like she was quite nervous as well, Vernon.
Well, I think she was just rather bored. I mean, she was very timid. I mean, it was quite extraordinary. I mean, and if you look at sort of interviews of her, and there's many you can find online, she is just very non-committal. She never says anything, in a sense, dramatically or perhaps memorably. But basically, so at this stage, what had happened is that the Punjab had become a particular issue in the sense that she had, her party in the Punjab's Congress Party had particular alliances with factions of the Punjabi party called the Akali Dal. And this is an interesting technique of Indira Gandhi's, which I think is quite well documented. You deal with the opposition because you basically factionalize them, and you get one side to fight the other. And again, it's a kind of colonial handbook technique. It's almost again, something that the British would have understood. You basically get the moderates to take out the radicals and then hope that the moderates will come in with you. And so she was trying to isolate a kind of hardcore Punjabi independent, Sikh independent state by some form of share, accord with the moderates who wanted to stay in the federal system. But basically, she picked a particularly virulent Sikh political leader, Bhindranwale, and lost control of him. And again, it's this idea that you're playing with fire. I mean, same, in a way, almost the same textbook as the emergency. You're doing something out of the box. You're not really in control of it. And in the end, you have to use force, just as you have to declare an emergency. You have to send the army into the Punjab. And worst of all, you have to send it into Amritsar, into, the Sikh holy temples. And it's the carnage that takes place in the temples that actually leads the Sikh bodyguards who had managed to be outside of office on rota together as part of her National Guard, who assassinated her.
So she was murdered by a Sikh?
She was murdered by two Sikh soldiers who effectively, she was, at the time, so it was complete chaos, because what then happened, she was taken to the All Indian Medical Institute, but she was clearly dead. She'd been shot about over 30, 40 times.
Right.
At close range. But what then happened was this appalling situation. Again, part of the sort of trope of communal politics where Sikhs were just being turned on by Hindus and killed. And my experience of this was quite remarkable, because in Sutlej Hostel, which is where I was staying, I saw many students take Sikhs in to hide, and they had removed their turbans because in other parts of Delhi, even in sort of South Delhi, quite posh, people were going around houses and rounding people up, and that she was responsible for that in a sense. She didn't do it, but she created this climate.
Yes, yeah.
And again, the arguments always, the sort of stories is that there were lists, people knew where people were, and to some extent the program was organised.
The picture that you've painted of her through this interview is of somebody that clearly wasn't as savvy as her father.
Yes.
And also as somebody who wasn't ever really in control of any particular program that she was trying to push through. When I was researching for this interview, I read that Gandhi, just before her death, confided to a friend, I was so sure I had nothing in me to be admired. Aside from the insecurity that quote lays bare, do you agree with her? Do you think she did have any redeeming features?
Well, I think to some extent, one thing that I give her credit for, ironically, is that she did have a coherent view of foreign policy to some extent.
Yes.
She did have a very savvy, she was far more savvy in terms of geopolitics than she was about domestic politics, which is quite extraordinary. And she was very clever at irritating the Americans, but not quite siding with the Russians. And there were problems about this. She was deeply shocked with the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, which of course was a fellow non-aligned country in 1980. Yes. The very famous story that she sort of berated the Russian premier on the phone until one of his secretaries took her off. And of course, Nixon had referred to her very notoriously in 1970 in the 70s as that bitch Indira.
I saw a picture of the two of them together. She was
remarkably a significant leader.
For sure.
Politics. But I do think when it comes to domestic politics, I think you're right. She understood how to do things, but not why she was doing them. in a way. And of course, facing these incredibly complex processes, a very sophisticated but complicated political system. But one is struck by the idea that she could never see beyond her own advantage. And of course, the reason for that is that she thought, in a way, I think, like perhaps all people, she was India, in a way. I think the distinction towards the end had disappeared. So I'm not saying, it's almost saying she's psychotic, but I'm not saying that. But I think there was her political outlook had fused, just as she'd fused the party with the parliament, she'd fused herself with India. And that meant that she had no scope to negotiate or to have a conversation.
The impression I get from what you've said is that you actually feel quite sorry for her.
I think I do. Of course, there is the idea that this loneliness, this sort of isolation, was kind of reinforced by her experiences of the emergency. What came with it, I think, was an inability to trust. And I think that inability to trust led to an inability to delegate, and to basically, risk sort of coalitional attempts to reform with other like-minded parties. It was a kind of egomania.
You mentioned her in relation to Nixon, and I found a picture of them together when I was researching for this, and it sort of reminded me of two divorced parents at their child's graduation. They look really uncomfortable together next to each other, but actually quite similar characters in lots of ways.
Absolutely.
Suspicious, paranoid, intransigent.
Absolutely. Yes. And prepared to escalate as opposed to kind of quieten things down and compromise. Yeah. There was always that part of her which was to kind of escalate, but also the kind of melodrama that she had. I remember interviewing her daughter-in-law, Manika Gandhi, who once said to me, just before she's assassinated, she had said, every drop of my blood, if I will shed for India, which of course became a terribly prophetic remark to have made. But as Manika Gandhi said, she was always saying something like that. That was sort of language she used.
On a final note then, the emergency and this unprecedented infringement of personal and political freedom that she inflicted upon her own country, if you fast forward to the present, 40, 45 years later, her party, the Congress Party, is in disarray. It's still plagued by nepotism, personalised leadership, but it's not in power, and the person that is in power is somebody who could also be described as paranoid, authoritarian. Do you think that India is going to have another emergency moment?
I don't think it will. If it is, it will be of a slightly different gloss, because I think that Modi is a very different politician, I think, because he's got a much more organised ideological basis and a much more kind of ideologically sort of sophisticated party. Again, it goes back to the kind of paucity of any ideological program behind the emergency. It's almost as if she did what she did to save herself, and then thought, I've got to have a program now to justify what I've just done.
It almost seems like it was the whole thing was the result of incompetence and disorganisation.
Yes. Where with Modi, I think that what you've got is a long-term program, which I think comes, from a long-standing social movement or religious organisation, the RSS, but which, is equally problematic. And it is, Indian observers are increasingly saying, we thought under Congress we were going to get a rather unique case of a sort of parliamentary federal democracy working with, a relatively visible Westminster blueprint. Or with Modi, what we're getting is a kind of ethnic democracy, where the Hindu vote for one party. And what Modi has done, and this goes back to the fact I would never believe he would have certainly become Prime Minister with the majority he's got, is that we know many Hindus, they have huge differences between them. They're not a cohesive natural majority. I mean, it's not just jati and caste, it's language.
It's like saying white Americans are
absolutely,
Yeah.
And yet somehow, so the risk of an emergency is that at some stage, in some way, the fusing together of the Hindu majority will fissure. I mean, certainly the case is that the Janata Party, when it came to power in 1977, did try to reverse and indeed amend some of the emergency clauses in the Constitution so that you would not have a rerun. But that didn't happen. And they are still, in a sense, in the Constitution. So it's a federal system, quasi-federal, in that the centre has particular powers. They're still there. But the other point I would say is that I think Modi's rise to power is linked to that final phase of Indira Gandhi's manipulation of religious identity from 1980 to 84.
I suppose, as a final point, the organisation of Modi's programme relative to Indira's does make it more worrying in lots of ways.
Absolutely, because it's far more efficient.
Yeah.
And it's much more coherent. Because I think if you look over Indira Gandhi's whole legacy, it was all she was an opportunist, and she's constantly reacting to things. Where I think, to some extent, for good or ill, the BJP and the wider Hindutva has had a plan.
It's been a really interesting conversation, Vernon. I've really enjoyed speaking to you. Just for people listening, where can people find your work? Where can people see you?
Well, so basically my PhD, which is looking at the emergency, is still available. It's published by Routledge, and I think that the longer we get away from the emergency, of course, the better the perspectives are. I have written in this book, in a way, about the connections between the terrible difficulties that India was facing in the 90s, the whole Ayodhya, the demolition of the mosque, and the rise of the Hindutva. And I have, in a sense, made a connection with the emergency. And people can certainly look at that. But it is one to watch, because, the other point that I think I'm as amazed at Modi being in power with such a large majority. I'm also amazed at an Indian economy that was growing at 12.5, 14% in the 90s and the early part of the noughties. I mean, the kind of liberalisation policies are all staggering as well. I mean, it's a fundamentally different country. This is now, a country with a security alliance with the Israelis, and basically a much closer relationship with the US. This is a country which, in fact, was basically given the green light to have a sort of, nuclear arsenal, despite not being a signatory. I mean, all of, the whole thing kind of changed, and, it is a fascinating place to study.
Well, perhaps I will organise another interview at some stage with you to discuss the later period around another figure. I think that would be a really interesting conversation to contrast with this one. Vernon, thank you so much. I said at the start of the podcast that you didn't necessarily remember me from Bristol. I certainly remembered you. I always really enjoyed your lessons. I have in my mind, I only have one phrase of yours that I can remember verbatim, which was, "If only Hitler had been a successful effing painter."
That's right.
And maybe, which I did write it down because I really wanted to say it again. Perhaps we'll do an interview about Hitler sometime, and you can unpack that a bit.
It's very good to see you and talk to you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Vernon. Cheers.
Okay. Take care.
Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please follow it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts to get updates whenever new episodes are released.